Alright, let's sleep. Pull the covers up to your chin. Fluff your pillow. Turn off your phone, or better yet, throw it across the room. Tonight, we're traveling back to the 14th century, to a world that was about to be turned upside down by something so small that no one could see it, so fast that no one could outrun it, and so deadly that it would change everything. Imagine, if you will, a world without antibiotics. A world without germ theory. A world where the most advanced medical treatment involved leeches, prayers, and the occasional whiff of lavender. Now imagine that into this world comes a disease so swift and so merciless that people who went to bed healthy were dead by breakfast. A disease that turned the living into corpses in 3 days flat. A disease that killed 1 out of every 3 people you knew, your neighbor, your priest, your mother, your child. This is the story of the Black Death. But it's not just a story of death, it's a story of life. Of how people reacted when their world collapsed. Of how they blamed, prayed, fled, and fought. Of how, out of the ashes of the greatest catastrophe in human history, something new was born. So settle in. We're going to start at the beginning, which, as it happens, is not in Europe at all, but on the other side of the world, in the vast, dry plains of Central Asia. Part 1, The Spark, a siege, a ship, and a very bad idea. Our story begins in 1346, in a place called Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean peninsula, overlooking the Black Sea. Kaffa was a bustling hub of commerce, Italian merchants trading silks, spices, and slaves with Mongol merchants from the east. It was the kind of place where you could buy anything, if you had the gold. But in 1346, Kaffa was under siege. The attacking army was led by a Mongol Khan named Janabeg, who had a grudge against the Genoese and wanted their wealth. For months, Janabeg's army surrounded the city, but the walls were strong and the Genoese were stubborn. The siege dragged on, and both sides grew tired, hungry, and desperate. Then something terrible happened inside Janabeg's camp. A mysterious illness began to sweep through his soldiers. Men who had been fine one day were racked with fever the next. Strange swellings appeared in their groins and armpits, black, angry lumps that oozed blood and pus. Within days, they were dead. The disease spread through the camp like wildfire, killing thousands of Janabeg's best warriors. Janabeg was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. He looked at his dying army, looked at the unbreached walls of Kaffa, and had an idea so grotesque, so utterly medieval, that it would go down in history as one of the most creative acts of biological warfare ever attempted. He ordered his men to load the plague-infested corpses of their dead comrades into trebuchets, those giant catapults used for hurling boulders, and launched them over the walls of Kaffa. Imagine being a Genoese merchant, huddled behind those walls, when suddenly a rotting body comes flying over the parapet and splatters at your feet. You scream. You run. But it's too late. The fleas that had feasted on the dead Mongols were now looking for new hosts. And you were available. The Genoese, horrified and infected, packed their ships and fled Kaffa, sailing west toward the Mediterranean. They didn't know they were carrying the apocalypse in their holds. They didn't know that the rats scurrying in their cargo, and the fleas on those rats, were about to unleash the greatest pandemic in human history. The Genoese ships sailed from Kaffa to Constantinople, then to the Mediterranean ports of Italy. In October 1347, 12 of these ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people of Messina gathered on the docks, eager to greet the sailors and buy their exotic goods. What they saw instead was a nightmare. Most of the sailors were dead. The few who were still alive were covered in black, weeping boils. They were burning with fever, delirious, coughing up blood. They stumbled off the ships like zombies, gasping for air, collapsing on the docks. The Sicilian authorities panicked. They ordered the death ships out of the harbor immediately. But it was far too late. The plague had already come ashore, not just in the bodies of the dying sailors, but in the rats that had scurried down the mooring ropes, and the fleas that had jumped from the dying to the living. Within days, Messina was in chaos. People began dropping like flies. The swellings, the buboes, appeared on young and old, rich and poor. The symptoms were horrifying. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague, described them vividly, in men and women alike. At the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. Blood and pus seeped out of these swellings. Then came fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and terrible aches. And then, in 3 days, sometimes less, death. The disease was terrifyingly contagious. Boccaccio wrote that, the mere touching of the clothes appeared to itself to communicate the malady to the toucher. People who were perfectly healthy when they went to bed could be dead by morning. Messina was just the beginning. From Sicily, the plague spread like a tidal wave. It hit mainland Italy, then France, Spain, and North Africa. By the spring of 1348, it had crossed the English Channel. Let's follow the plague's journey across Europe, because it's one of the most terrifying road trips in history. The plague traveled along trade routes, the arteries of medieval commerce. It jumped from port to port, city to city, carried by rats, fleas, and the unwitting merchants who transported them. It moved at the speed of a sailing ship or a merchant's cart, which, in the 14th century, was faster than anyone could run. In the spring of 1348, the plague reached Marseille, the great French port on the Mediterranean. From Marseille, it spread north and west, following the Rhone River into the heart of France. It hit Paris in the summer of 1348, and by autumn, it was in the Low Countries and Germany. The numbers are staggering. By 1351, the Black Death had killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe. That's 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. In some places, the mortality rate was even higher, 60% or more. Paris lost half its population of 100,000. In London, 60% of the city's residents were wiped out between autumn 1348 and spring 1349. Imagine your city losing half its people in a single year. Imagine walking down the street and seeing empty houses, abandoned shops, and bodies lying in the gutters. Imagine the smell. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the pious and the sinful. It killed kings and peasants alike. It killed the doctors who tried to treat it, the priests who tried to pray it away, and the gravediggers who tried to bury the dead. Let's zoom in on one country, England. Because the English story of the Black Death is particularly vivid, and particularly absurd. In August 1348, a ship from the French port of Calais carried the plague to the Dorset coast, landing at a place called Melcombe Regis. The plague spread to Bristol almost immediately, then raced through the southwestern counties. London suffered most violently between February and May 1349. The city was a crowded, filthy warren of narrow streets, wooden houses, and open sewers. The rats loved it. The fleas loved it. The plague loved it. By the summer of 1349, the plague had reached East Anglia and Yorkshire. By 1350, it had pushed into the extreme north of England, then into Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries. The English chroniclers wrote with horror about what they saw. One described how the sheep and cattle strayed through the fields and among the crops, and there was no one to drive them or gather them in. Another wrote of villages where every single inhabitant died, leaving the houses standing empty, the fields untilled, the livestock roaming wild. In some villages, the death rate was so high that there was no one left to bury the dead. Bodies were piled in trenches, covered with a thin layer of earth, and left to rot. The gravediggers died, and the priests died, and the bishops died, and soon there was no one to perform the last rites. The King of England at the time was Edward III, the same Edward who had started the 100 Years' War. He was a capable warrior, but he was utterly helpless against this invisible enemy. He tried to issue proclamations, ordering people to stay in their homes, but the plague didn't care about royal decrees. He tried to pray, but God seemed to be on holiday. Now, let's talk about medieval medicine, because it's both fascinating and hilarious, in a dark sort of way. The doctors of the 14th century had no idea what caused the plague. They didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or fleas. They operated on a theory called humorism, the idea that the body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors. So their treatments were designed to restore balance. If you had too much blood, they bled you with leeches, or with a lancet. If you had too much phlegm, they made you vomit. If you had too much black bile, they gave you laxatives. It was like trying to fix a broken car by kicking the tires. Some doctors recommended more imaginative treatments. One popular theory was that the plague was caused by bad air, a miasma that rose from swamps and cesspits. To ward off this bad air, people carried posies of flowers, burned incense, or sat in rooms filled with the smoke of aromatic herbs. Another theory was that the plague was a punishment from God, which led to a whole different set of responses, which we'll get to in a moment. The most sensible medical advice, and this was actually quite smart, was to run away. Fly away speedily, advised one 14th century doctor. If you could afford to leave the city and retreat to the countryside, you had a much better chance of survival. The wealthy fled to their country estates. The poor, of course, had nowhere to go. Some doctors tried more aggressive interventions. They lanced the buboes, draining the pus and blood, which sometimes helped, but more often just spread the infection. They applied poultices of herbs, spices, and even ground up precious stones. They prescribed diets of bland food, or, conversely, rich food to strengthen the humors. None of it worked. The plague was a biological weapon, and medieval medicine was a water pistol. If medicine couldn't save you, maybe religion could. And this is where things get really strange. The Black Death triggered an outbreak of religious fervor unlike anything Europe had ever seen. People believed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, so the logical response was to repent. But repenting in the 14th century was not a quiet, private affair. It was loud, public, and often violent. Enter the flagellants. The flagellants were groups of men, and sometimes women, who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps studded with metal spikes. They believed that by inflicting pain on their own bodies, they could atone for the sins of humanity and persuade God to end the plague. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, trying to survive the plague, and a group of half-naked strangers marches into your village, singing hymns and beating themselves bloody. They're covered in welts and wounds, their backs are a mess of scar tissue, and they're screaming about the end of the world. You'd probably think they were crazy, but in 1349, they were considered holy. The flagellants were particularly popular in Germany, where they emerged in large numbers in late 1348. They marched through the streets, whipping themselves in elaborate ceremonies, and attracted huge crowds of terrified onlookers. Some people even joined them, hoping that the pain would save their souls. But the flagellants had a dark side. They blamed the plague on the usual suspects, outsiders, heretics, and especially the Jews. The theory was that the Jews had poisoned the wells, causing the plague to spread. This was, of course, complete nonsense, but in a time of panic, nonsense can be deadly. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death was horrific. In towns across Germany, France, and the Low Countries, Jewish communities were attacked, massacred, or burned alive. In Strasbourg, for example, the entire Jewish population, several hundred people, was herded onto a wooden platform and burned to death. Similar pogroms occurred in Frankfurt, Cologne, and many other cities. The Church, to its credit, tried to stop the violence. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in 1348, condemning the persecution of Jews and pointing out that the plague was also killing Jews, so clearly they couldn't be the cause. But the Pope was in Avignon, and the mobs were in the streets. His words had little effect. The flagellants were eventually condemned by the church as heretics, and the movement faded away, but not before it had left a trail of blood and ashes across Europe. Let's pause for a moment and think about what it was like to live through the Black Death. Because the statistics, 25 million dead, 30 to 60% mortality, are so large that they become abstract. But for the people who lived through it, it was anything but abstract. Imagine you're a farmer in a small English village in 1349. Your name is William, and you're 30 years old. You have a wife, 3 children, and a small plot of land that you rent from the local lord. You work hard, you pay your taxes, and you go to church every Sunday. Life is hard, but it's predictable. Then the plague arrives. Your neighbor, John, is the first to go. He develops a fever, then the swellings appear in his groin. Within 3 days, he's dead. His wife, Margaret, dies a week later. Their children are orphaned, but you can't take them in because you're afraid they might be infected. Then your own wife falls ill. You watch her suffer, and there's nothing you can do. The priest won't come because he's already buried 20 people this week and he's exhausted. The doctor won't come because he's dead. You hold her hand as she gasps her last breath. Your children die next, first the youngest, then the eldest. You bury them in the churchyard, but there's no priest to say the words, so you say them yourself. You dig the graves, because the gravedigger is dead too. You're now alone in a village that used to have 50 families. Now there are 10. The fields are untilled. The livestock roam wild. The church bell doesn't ring because there's no one to ring it. What do? You could stay and starve, or you could leave and hope to find work somewhere else. You pack your few belongings and walk to the next village, but it's the same story there. Empty houses. Overgrown fields. The smell of death. This was the reality for millions of people. The Black Death didn't just kill individuals, it killed communities. It destroyed families, emptied villages, and left a scar on the landscape that took generations to heal. But here's the twist, out of all this death came something unexpected, a new world. The Black Death caused a massive labor shortage. With so many people dead, there weren't enough workers to tend the fields, harvest the crops, or perform the countless tasks that kept the medieval economy running. Landowners, desperate for labor, had to compete for workers. And that meant paying higher wages. Suddenly, peasants had bargaining power. For centuries, they had been tied to the land, forced to work for their lords in exchange for protection and a small plot of land. But now, with labor scarce, they could demand better conditions. They could leave their villages and go where the pay was better. The lords were furious. They tried to hold the line, passing laws to cap wages and force peasants to stay in their villages. In England, King Edward III issued the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which set maximum wages and forbade peasants from leaving their homes without permission. But the law was almost impossible to enforce. There were too many jobs and too few workers. Wages rose. The cost of living rose. And the peasants, for the first time in centuries, began to dream of something better. This economic upheaval eventually led to social upheaval. In 1381, 30 years after the Black Death, the pent-up anger of the English peasantry exploded in the Peasants' Revolt. Thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and more freedom. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, burned the Savoy Palace, and terrorized the ruling class. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but the damage was done. The ruling class had seen that the peasants were no longer docile. The old order was crumbling. Over the next century, serfdom gradually disappeared in England. The feudal system, which had been the foundation of medieval society for hundreds of years, was replaced by a more flexible, market-based economy. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed feudalism. The Black Death also left its mark on culture, and it wasn't pretty. Before the plague, Medieval art was full of bright colors, happy saints, and scenes of heavenly bliss. After the plague, something darker emerged. Artists began to depict death in all its gruesome reality. Skeletons, rotting corpses, and the Grim Reaper became popular subjects. The most famous of these cultural expressions was the Dance of Death, a macabre allegory in which death, personified as a skeleton, leads people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, and children, in a dance to the grave. The message was clear: no one escapes death. Not the rich, not the powerful, not the holy. Death is the great equalizer. This obsession with death wasn't just morbid, it was also a kind of liberation. If death was inevitable, then why not enjoy life while you could? Why not eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you might be dead? This attitude led to a new emphasis on pleasure, luxury, and the enjoyment of the present moment. It also led to a certain cynicism about the church. If the church couldn't save you from the plague, then what was the point of all those indulgences and pilgrimages? The seeds of the Reformation were sown in the graveyards of the Black Death. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was the first and worst wave, but it wasn't the last. The plague returned again and again over the next 3 centuries. There were major outbreaks in 1361 to 63, 1369 to 71, 1374 to 75, 1390, and 1400. Each time, it killed thousands, though never as many as the first wave. In England alone, the plague caused the depopulation or total disappearance of about 1,000 villages. The population of England was about half what it had been 100 years earlier. It took until the 16th century for the population to recover to pre-plague levels. The repeated outbreaks meant that the fear of plague became a permanent feature of medieval life. People lived with the knowledge that the disease could return at any time, and it often did. One of the most lasting legacies of the Black Death was the invention of quarantine. In 1377, the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, passed a remarkable law. It stipulated that, those who come from plague-infested areas shall not enter Ragusa or its district unless they spend a month on the islet of Mercan or in the town of Kavtak, for the purpose of disinfection. This was the world's first mandatory quarantine. The officials of Ragusa didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they understood that people who seemed healthy could still be carrying the disease. They understood the concept of an incubation period. They understood that isolating new arrivals for a period of time could prevent the spread of infection. The 30-day period was called a Trentino. Later, it was extended to 40 days, a number with religious significance, 40 days of rain, 40 days in the wilderness, and the Italian word for 40 days, quarantino, gave us the English word, quarantine. This was one of the highest achievements of medieval medicine. It showed that even without modern science, human beings could learn, adapt, and find ways to protect themselves. So, my sleepy friend, what do we take from this story of death, madness, and transformation? First, the Black Death was a biological earthquake that reshaped the entire landscape of European society. It killed tens of millions of people, but it also killed the old order, feudalism, serfdom, and the unquestioned authority of the church. Second, human beings are remarkably resilient. Despite the horror, despite the loss, people found ways to survive, adapt, and rebuild. The survivors of the Black Death didn't just mourn the dead, they built a new world. Third, fear makes people do crazy things. The flagellants, the persecution of Jews, the desperate medical treatments, all of these were responses to a terror so profound that people would try anything, believe anything, to make it stop. We should remember this when we see panic in our own time. Fourth, the Black Death was a great leveler. It killed the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless. It showed that no one is immune to tragedy, but also that everyone, no matter how humble, has value. And finally, from death comes life. The labor shortages caused by the plague gave peasants bargaining power for the first time. Wages rose, serfdom declined, and the foundations of the modern economy were laid. The cultural obsession with death gave rise to new forms of art, literature, and philosophy. And the quarantine measures developed during the plague became the basis for modern public health. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're a medieval peasant in 1351, one of the lucky ones who survived. You look around at the empty houses, the overgrown fields, the silent church. You've lost your family, your friends, your entire world. But you're alive. And because you're alive, you can start again. You can demand better wages, better conditions, a better life. You can leave your village and seek your fortune elsewhere. You can marry again, have children again, build a new community. The road ahead is hard, but it's yours to walk. Now think about your own life. You have antibiotics, vaccines, and modern medicine. You have governments that can coordinate public health responses. You have scientists who can identify a pathogen in days, not years. You have the accumulated knowledge of centuries. And yet, the Black Death still matters. It reminds us that we are not invincible. It reminds us that our societies are fragile. It reminds us that fear can make us cruel, but also that courage can make us strong. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for the small things, your health, your family, your warm bed. Be grateful that you don't have to worry about buboes or fleas or the smell of death in the streets. Be grateful that you live in a time when a plague, while still terrifying, is no longer a death sentence for half the population. And remember the lesson of the Black Death, even in the darkest times, human beings find a way to survive, to adapt, and to build something new. The kings are gone. The flagellants have faded into history. The rats and the fleas are still with us, but we know how to fight them now. All that remains is a quiet story, told under a warm blanket, to remind you that we have been through worse, and we came out the other side. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be free of buboes, trebuchets, and French ships carrying bad news. Good night.